Hello ladies and gentlemen. Welcome. This is a quick tutorial for how to do nebulae without any textures in Empire at War. We'll go over the method for creating the mesh and how to export that to the game. It's actually quite simple, though there are a few tools you're going to have to be familiar with, which I will all explain right here. Credit to basically everything for thinking this whole thing up, including figuring out how to export it and all that to Enpremi or Adam. And a massive thank you, of course, for sharing it. Though, first of all, why would you want to make nebulae in this game without any textures? Isn't it much easier to work with textures? Well, at some point, yes. But I find myself that to get the requisite amount of pixel density on the nebulae needed to really get it to look good at lower FOV amounts, you really need to use a lot of very high resolution textures, and I honestly think that using this method you can get a better result, plus of course you save the memory in the textures that you have to load. So yeah, that's basically it. This allows for greater pixel density, so better looking resolution, so to say, and of course you don't have to load a single texture to do this. We are going to use the Vertex painting to create colors and patterns on a geosphere. That's really the long and short of it. We're going to start. I am making this in 3ds Max 16. You can also do this in 3ds Max 8 or 9 or whichever you prefer. I am basically going to do it in Max 16, and I will then export it to a format which can then be imported into Max 8 and 9, which will preserve the vertex colors. And then you can of course simply attach the shader in that program and export it to ALO. But you could circumvent the whole thing entirely and just do it in Max 8. I just find it more useful to do it this way, since I prefer working in 16. Well, that's what I use anyway. I'm assuming this works at 15, 17, whatever you use. You just get a few more tools if you do it in updated versions. We work with a geosphere, by the way, simply because it has a roughly equal amount of distance in between the vertices. Now, I'm going to merge my own star field. It should be somewhere. Distinct Galaxy? No. You can disregard this. I just would like to have my own starfield background in the back, so I can roughly get an idea of what we are looking at in terms of size. Asteroid, black hole, planet. Did I call it galaxy? No. I mean, this doesn't really matter, but... No. Planet. Universe SkyDome. There we go. Get the whole thing. Voila. And that is the SkyDome. Now, I'm going to quickly size our geosphere up to a roughly same amount. Of course, if you are using nebulae, you gotta keep in mind the Z fighting and the fact that it has to be on the inside of the dome and be slightly smaller. Kind of like this. Not too small, of course. I also want to increase the amount of segments, since of course we are using the vertices to paint. You want a fairly high number of segments. Though of course not too many, otherwise the size will grow out of control. Let's see. That should be about right. Alright, now we remove everything but our new geosphere, and this will be our nebulae. Or nebula. Doesn't really matter. Downside. You will have to paint a separate thing for every variant of the SkyDome, basically. But that's not really a problem. Alright, so now into the nitty-gritty of it. Let's try. Alright, so we have our geosphere here with equal lengths between the vertices. That's of course why we are using a geosphere and not a sphere, where if we used an actual sphere, you don't have equal sides in between the vertices. Now, we are going to paint this first using the random select of the ribbon. I will show you how to get all this to show up, and then we are going to use the paint or Vertex Paint modifier to finish it off. Now, this is basically just a proof of concept. I'm not going to be making an entire thing myself, since it does take quite a bit of time to do that, and I just want to show you the method so you can do it yourself. First, you want to click on toggle ribbon, which will give you either up here or down here. If it's up here, you can simply take it and then put it down here. Thankfully, the interface is fairly customizable. You can also go to, I think it is customize, show UI, and then show ribbon if you don't have this particular button. Now, in here, there is a thing called selection, which you can click on it and sometimes it doesn't appear. For example, if we now go into the Vertex Paint modifier, we get this. Don't worry about this for now. It won't show up. You do need to do this, sadly, from what I know, in editable poly. When you open it, you get an empty menu, but when you actually click on it, you can now see that it appears. Now, there's a whole bunch of scary shit here. Don't worry about it. I'm gonna help you get familiar with basically what you need. What this lets you do, what we mostly want is this tab here. This says by random. It allows you to select a random selection of these vertices, which is actually very useful for pattern linking. Now, first I want to select about 30% of all these vertices. I simply type in %. You can also go by number, of course, if you want a specific number. You know what? Let's actually start with a large pattern. Let's select only 50 vertices, and we go to not select within current selection because we don't have anything selected right now. We go to select, and now we have 15 vertices randomly selected. We're going to grow a couple, random grow, and then we are going to go to random shrink and then a random grow again to kind of get this random pattern going. Now, right now everything is white. Let's see. Got the select, and now we can set the color to, say, black. Now, this is not going to show up right now, but when we are going to apply our Vertex Paint, you can clearly see here that we now have a whole bunch of stuff. I'm going to quickly condense this to a single layer, which is this button right here. Will be applied. Yes, I want everything to be in a same layer. And now we can press the blur all, which will kind of blur the whole thing away. Kind of like that. So now we get a very basic starting pattern to start with. Convert back to editable poly. See, when you click the vertex, now suddenly our menu has returned to us. And we really want this because it allows you to basically randomly select a bunch of shit. Now we are going to go to select 30% of all the vertices. Select. And now you can do this again by using the select within current selection, which will just select 30% of the vertices that you currently have selected. So now we have even fewer, and then we just go to a couple of random grow, and a couple of random shrink, a couple of random grow, a couple of random shrink. You can do this a couple of times, and you can just basically get a randomized selection out of it. Now we're going to set this to maybe slightly green. You know what? I would like this to be a little bit more put together instead of randomized. So what we do is we unselect it. We go to say select 20% of all vertices. Actually, let's go to 5. Then we go to select, and now we do a bit of random grow. Like so. Now we have a couple of patches, and now we make it slightly green. Kind of like that. We now have a little bit of color on our thing, and you now know how the random select works. There are more things you can do. For example, if we just now select one side of this, kind of like so, and we do a whole bunch of random grow, we now have a or we do that, and maybe even say that, and we do a couple more random grow, and a couple of random shrink, and a couple of random grow, and now we have a whole, we have kind of like a pattern. You see, we now have a small pattern selected. Let's make it a little bit more green with a little bit of blue in between. There we go. And that's just one of the many ways you can use this. Now, as you can clearly see here, it looks kind of pixelated, but that's just in 3ds Max, don't worry about this. Because what we can now do is we can apply our Vertex Paint, which will give you a new menu here. Of course, this here now disappears. Don't worry about that for now. Sadly, if you go now to Vertex and you select this, our random selection is gone. But again, don't worry about that. First of all, I want to kind of blur what we currently have, since this is a very, very sharp transition. But if I now press blur, this doesn't work, because this is a different display channel, a different paint channel, something like that. It doesn't really matter, because we can simply say condense the single layer, and now everything will be affected by the blur, as you can see. See, now we kind of have this. Kind of looks like one of the vanilla game's low resolution planets, to be honest. But that's okay, obviously this is not meant to be a real thing for now. You can do this yourself, of course, with more. If you want more size on your geosphere, of course you will increase the quality. But of course it also increases size. Now what we can do is we can select paint. And we can go to color. And we can start painting with, perhaps, let's go with a little bit of yellow, right? A little bit darker too. Maybe a little bit of brown. No, does that not select the whole thing? Hang on a second. Display that. Opacity, size, brush options. No, that looks about right. I will tell you a little bit about the brush options in just a bit. Why can I not paint? Hang on. Editable poly. Vertex Paint. Brush. Do I have the gizmo disabled? No. Oh, of course, because our object is now so large you cannot see the brush. Yeah, that was it. So you're going to have to simply increase the size a couple times. Let's start with a 5000 size. Let's see, can we do it without the... Oh, what the fuck, that's the wrong button. Sorry about that. Anyway, it doesn't matter. I mean, right now we can see the thing. I would like to get the edges gone. Ah, thank you. Okay. Edges are now gone, and we can begin kind of painting like this. There are many brush options that you can use. Of course, you can make the opacity a lot less, so you only get a slight hint of the color. Basically, this is what you can use to really get your nebulae going. Nebula. Space. Now, you don't obviously need to create all sorts of fancy patterns like this, but you can, depending on how much time you spend. But using the randomization selection that we basically did earlier, remember, if you want to do that, you have to go to Convert to Editable Poly. Click on that so that vertex is selected, and then you can get your ribbon. Again, the way you get your ribbon is toggle ribbon on, or simply go to Customize, Show UI, Show Ribbon, and then you can select your randomized stuff. Using the randomized selection, you can create things like this if you spend a little bit of time on it. We already passed that stage. Vertex Paint, there we go. Brush. The way you can use the brush in interesting ways is, for example, this is now. Let's have a little bit more red. Go to 10,000. we now have a fairly large brush, but as you can see, it is fairly sharp. So what you want to do is you want to go to brush options right here, and then you can kind of change the way the brush. This curve right here is the curve from the middle, the intensity from the middle to the outside. So if you now, for example, put this up, you get this. But if you put it significantly down, you get a far harder but closer, as you can see here now it's in the negative, color. Now if you use, for example, this and you set the opacity to say 10%, okay, so maybe it doesn't quite play nice with the negative options. So we go Control Z and we undo that, and we now go back here. Other interesting things you can do is, hang on, where do I set a point? There we go, scale add point. There, and now we can, for example, I just wanted 1, and then we move that around a little bit. We go kind of like so. Take our point there. And now we can do something like this, and we set that to, oh, can I not set this both to zoom extends? Alright, so basically you can play around with this a little bit and you can get widely different results, such as that. Or remove points. We can set this to, for example, 0, and we can set that to, for example, 1. And now what we get is, where'd my damn thing go? Oh, when I pressed delete, I accidentally deleted the whole thing. That's of course not the intention. You have to use the delete point thing for this. You can set this to like that, and this to there, and now when you paint with a little bit of a larger brush, you can get that. As you can see, the inside is less hard than the outside here. Though, of course, for most of these purposes, I imagine you want to use high, low. Though you can, of course, create a fairly nice 0 and then add point. Set that up, for example, here. And now you have that. And of course, you can create all sorts of shapes, and sizes with this, and patterns at different levels of roughness. However, something that is important to remember is that if you think, for example, what you did here is far too rough, you can simply blur it a couple times. And remember, since we haven't flattened the layer yet, you are not going to affect the underlying layer. Though if you do end up flattening this, condense the single layer, and you then blur, you're also going to blur all of your other work. Now, of course, this looks rather silly because this is just a random assortment of colors with no pattern whatsoever. But using this correctly, you can get all sorts of very, very, very interesting effects indeed, including that, or I imagine with a bunch of work, you can even create this. Now, of course, it's not needed that you do this, but we just basically want for the remake mod at least, we are looking for a more ambient nebula without a whole lot of specific detail on it, just a color which is slowly randomized, more like a gradient, like the background in this location here, much more than, say, the very specific details of this, though of course you can very easily paint on a bunch of detail like this. Yeah, kind of like this ambient background color here. Now, I do not recommend trying to create stars on this. If you want that, I definitely do recommend using a starfield texture and not putting it on the nebula itself, since it's just not going to look right. Opinion me. Anyway, so you now know how the brush works. Of course, you can erase as well. Brush size, palette. Yeah, of course, you can add a whole bunch of colors if you want. Oh, right. Blur brush. Very, very useful, obviously. Blur what you are doing. And of course the strength. You can adjust the colors a little bit. Let's do that. See, you can very, very easily create all sorts of... Ooh, I do want to apply that, of course. You can very easily create all sorts of fancy colors and... Well, I mean the possibility are endless. Depending on how much time you spend, you can do a whole lot of interesting stuff. Anyway, wouldn't recommend messing too much with this. Though, of course, you can. Depending on. And, of course, the opacity. And, of course, remember, since this is not flattened, this does not affect the whole thing. When we now flatten it... Oh, no. Of course not. See, the vertex weld right, or the vertex paint currently is on this Vertex Paint modifier. Don't do that. The editable poly vertex colors are what has the baseline, the randomized stuff that we did over here. So when we now overlaid, even if we flatten the layers, technically they are still two separate. There are still two separate layers, so to say. Yeah, I mean that's about it. It's not very complex, but I think it is very potent and it has a lot of potential depending on how you use it. Now you may ask, how the hell do we get this in Empire? Okay, now it's actually fairly simple. Do convert to editable poly just to prevent any sort of mess ups. Oh no, get rid of my ribbon again. Oh, definitely use this ribbon more. I mean, there's a lot of interesting stuff here. I don't know nearly how to use like even 5% of it, but it's very useful. If you don't already know how to do it, go find a tutorial online or something. We go to export, and then we are going to go to say whatever you want. We are going to save it as nebula, and we are going to save it as an FBX file. Both 3ds and OBJ do not export vertex colors, and we of course want to keep our nicely painted world, our beautiful nebula, our happy little nebula. So we go to FBX. Now, this is important. This is the FBX export menu. What you want to do is you want to open the FBX file format tab and you want to switch it to version 6, 2006 or 2009, depending on what 3ds Max you use. But I use Max 8 for my exporting to ALO, so I definitely recommend 2006 because it won't load 2009. I already tried. Now, by the way, if you use a actual model, like a Starship model, to export and you export bones with that, it will crash upon import. But because we do not have any bones in this, we just have our mesh, this will work fine. I tested it before this, just to make sure that all the information was correct, and it successfully imports 3ds Max 8, what I use, successfully imports this with no problems. Now we press OK. It will export it, and we now have our FBX file basically. What you want to do then is load up your 3ds Max, and you go to let's see, I can't show this because I don't have my recording program installed on my Windows 7, which is where I have my 3ds Max 8. What you want to do is you just import this whole thing, and when you go to the shaders, you want to apply the MeshAdditiveVColour. I will show you in the .mec file which one you need exactly. That's config. I am talking about shaders. There we go. You want to go to MeshAdditiveVColour. This maintains the vertex colors, which is of course the whole thing we are using to color our nebula. You simply apply this as the shader to our object, and then you export it. I believe it asks for a texture slot, and you need either a black or a white texture to fill. I can't recall entirely which one it was, but I do recall that it works. So just apply MeshAdditiveVColour to our object, and then export it like you would any other nebula. And voila, you have now painted a nebula for Empire at War without a texture. It's really good. Now remember, the size of your nebula, the size of your file is going to depend on the complexity of your geosphere. Do not create a geosphere with like 100 segments on Icosa like setting, because you're going to get 10 million polygons, and the game is going to be like, lol, no. At that point, you're going to have so many megabytes worth of model that you don't gain anything. The amount of space is the same as if you had used like 10 2K textures stretched across your nebula mesh, at which point there's no more use in this method. Of course, remember, this method is used because it uses no textures and you can save on memory that way, and it creates a pixel density level which you normally don't get. It will be blurry, but at least it will not be pixelated, which is what you would get if you had used a 2K texture across this instead. Also, there's of course no fucking problems with the goddamn like stretching of the texture anywhere. It's painted directly onto the vertices, which are equally spaced out. Remember, do not use a sphere, otherwise you will still get the stretching on top. Yeah, that's really all there's to it. It's fairly simple, but it's very potent, and depending on how much time you spend, as I said, you can get great results out of it. I hope you guys are able to use this tutorial and this technique to make some very interesting stuff, and I am looking forward to seeing what people can do with this. Remember, credit to Enpremi for figuring all this out. I'm just making the video. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you all for watching. I hope this has been informative, and if you have any questions at all, leave them down in the comments below on YouTube, and I will get to them when I can. For now, ladies and gentlemen, bye bye.